The latest rendition of the Ford Thunderbird and the Lincoln LS have a common fuel storage and delivery system. The saddlebag-shaped tank tucked above the dry shaft and exhaust system would require extensive work to remove. The designers chose to put top access holes in the car floor to access the pumps and fuel lines. The LS is a snap to work on because these access holes are under a removable seat. The Thunderbird tank is logistically in the same place, but a structural bulkhead that forms the shelf and wall behind the seat makes access a little more challenging. Still, removing the tank is far more demanding. My reason for removing the pumps was to remove water from the tank. As you can imagine, an 11-year-old car with 19,000 miles spends a fair amount of time in storage. The plastic tanks make for very little corrosion, but it is still prone to water collection. The right side of the tank, where the feed pickup is located, collected 3.5 liters of water before only water would get to the engine. The jet pump on the left side equalizes fuel across the saddle as it delivers fuel and any condensates to the right side only, thereby scavenging all contaminants from that side. Consequently, the left side had no contaminants or water. Here is what you will need to do to gain access to the T-Bird access ports for the fuel pumps. First, it is optional, but I suggest you remove the speaker covers. This photo shows the panel has 3 retaining clips, and this one shows the clip itself. If you find it difficult to pull them from the front, you will have to access them from the back of the bulkhead. To access the back of the bulkhead, with the top up, release the cloth liner of the bay for the retracted top along its rear and side perimeters. Pull the cloth forward, and the aft of the bulkhead and the finished panel clips will be accessible to aid in their removal. Having removed the speaker panels, put down the top. Move the seats completely forward. Then, disconnect the battery at the negative terminal in the trunk. Pull the rug from under the speaker bulkhead and the B pillar far enough so that it can stand perpendicular to the floor. At this point, you'll begin to realize the difficulty of the access. There are 2 oval holes in the shelf on either side that at their narrowest are less than 7 inches wide. 8 inches below the holes you will find 6.5-inch round body grommets. Pry these out. You now have access to the top of the fuel tank. It is most likely that the fuel tank was installed as a complete assembly, as removing the hoses from their sockets is not prudent for the lack of space. Removing the pipes can be accomplished once the top of the pumps can be manipulated. To remove the pumps for each side, do these things. Disconnect the electrical blocks and bring the feed side through the access hole. Raise the pipes in their sockets by squeezing their tabs and pushing downward while pulling upward on the pipes. This will prove to be difficult, as you are working basically within the confines of a tube-shaped access. I found that using a small pair of channel pliers to squeeze the release collars, combined with a piece of safety wire wrapped around the pipe head to pull from above the access hole, leaves space for hands, some light, visibility, and maneuvering. The pumps are held in place with a large polypropylene flange nut about 6 inches in diameter. If they have not been budged, as in my case since assembly 11 years ago, they will be very tight. Turning by hand will probably prove impossible, and there is little room to swing a hammer to impact the drift at the edge of the nut. I constructed a spanner bar from my metal scrap that works nicely in applying the necessary torque to loosen and then finally tighten the nuts. To loosen the nuts required a 16-inch L-bar on a 10-inch extension. They were quite tight. The nut shown here has the spanner fitted to illustrate functionality. The spanner needed to be repositioned 3 times for a quarter turn each until the nut was able to be worked by hand. The dimensions for the spanner work well and are not random, as they fit the nut and allow for the slant of the tank and the manipulation that has to be accomplished in the tight space available. Once the nut is off, the top of the pump flange will now move enough to allow the pipes to be removed from their collars with relative ease. Push the electrical feed connection back through the access hole and tuck it out of the way. Push the pipes outside the perimeter of the flange nut and remove the nut. The right pump flange is connected via flex tubing to the electrical pump unit that is clipped to a fixed tank housing. Lift the flange out of the tank and squeeze the tabs on the top of the pump to release it. Lift and manipulate the unit out of the tank, being careful of the float that extends 5.5 inches beyond the side of the pump toward the midline of the car. The left pump is very similar, except that it has 3 pipes, and the pump unit is held against the bottom of the tank by the flange and a spring-loaded telescoping mechanism. The left pump also has a float that extends to the midline of the car. Assembly is in the reverse order. Note that the flange plates have arrows that are oriented pointing to the front of the car. The left flange will tend to rotate under tightening. Note there are 2 depressions in the flange. I bent a piece of 1/4-inch rod to span the depressions and used that to hold the flange in place while tightening the flange nut. Also, the tank flange nuts are made of polypropylene and are very springy. Getting the threads to mate seemed impossible for me. I found that starting the nuts by hand until it was firm, then using the socket from my spanner tool to push firmly around the edge of the nut, I was able to seat the threads properly and tighten the nuts successfully. Failure to seat the flange nuts will leave its pump flange loose and likely lead to leaking. Remember, the exhaust system is directly in line for any resulting drips. Be sure to seat the gasket properly between the flange and the tank. The gasket is soft and flexible and can easily slip inside the tank during assembly.